Hello and namaste. I'm Namita, a social worker and a trainer.
And I am Rakshita, an autistic educator. We warmly welcome you to a unique podcast series, Daisies, Edelweises, and Irises, DEI in Education.
Despite education being a fundamental right for every child in India, statistics show that children with disabilities are the most vulnerable to being excluded from the system. Our collective vision is to enable and empower all stakeholders in the field of education. In this series, you will hear from parents, students, teachers, school management, and adults with disabilities about their aspirations and roadblocks.
Are we providing solutions on this podcast? No, we are not. Through this series, we intend to spread awareness about stakeholders' lived experiences and the latest evidence based best practices. We hope that our conversations lead to further thought provoking questions and critical reflection.
Good evening. Today's discussion will center on the perspectives of researchers. We have with us Dr. Sridevi Rao, Professor, Department of Special Education, Language and Literacy in the College of New Jersey. She is a Fulbright Nehru Senior Scholar 2020-2021 year. Mythili, an Associate Professor with Indira Mahindra School of Education, Mahindra University, and Tanushree Sarkar, a researcher studying inclusive education and disability with teachers in India. Thank you for joining us today. We warmly welcome each one of you.
My first question is to Shri, could you please throw some light on the recent developments in the inclusive education practices around the world?
So, I think one of the things that we have learned since the last 3 or 4 decades, since the concept of inclusive education came into being, is that there is no consistent definition of what inclusive education is. And there's really no consistent way in which it can be implemented in every setting across the world. So if you ask me what are one of the recent developments in inclusive education practice, I would say we are learning the importance of understanding the historical, cultural, social context of the countries into which inclusive education is introduced as an idea and a practice. And we are learning that the way that it morphs and the way that it is implemented looks different in different contexts. We are also learning the importance of really understanding local contexts, the local ways in which people in that place, whether different stakeholders, whether it's teachers, whether it's families, whether it's administrators, whether it's policymakers, how do the local stakeholders interpret, view children with disabilities? What is the larger framework of education? What are the larger challenges in the framework of education, which might be something that has to be taken into consideration when we are looking at the implementation of inclusive education. So more and more we are learning about the importance of the local context. And we are also learning about the importance of each context developing its own I would say, interpretation and ways of implementing inclusive education. The idea of inclusive education was introduced from the global north, and there's always been the assumption that the way that it was done or implemented by countries in the global north in the Western world was the way to go. and all of the other countries, including developing countries, should emulate that same model. And what we are learning is there is no universal model of inclusive education, that locally each of these countries need to wrestle with their own issues and come up with locally sustainable ways of implementing and defining inclusive education. The second aspect, which is also something that is being discovered, that's being I kind of talked about in the US, and I know that it's also reflected in the literature in the education in India, is the importance of understanding the ways in which some children might be multiply marginalized. So it's not as if disability is their only identity. There might be so many other intersectional aspects of their identity, and it's so important to understand those intersections. Within the US, we continue to see, or we continue to learn about how racism and ableism kind of work together so fluidly and have worked together for many years, and we continue to see the phenomena of children of color being placed in special ed classrooms, continuing to be placed in special ed classrooms disproportionately. We continue to see certain populations of children, including children with disabilities, but also embracing other identities, who continue to be subjected disproportionately to, more punitive forms or of discipline or more segregation. And so there's something going on there. And so the narrow lens that inclusion might take sometimes in terms of focusing on disability alone might not be able to address the complexities of the factors that are operating there. And third, I think what we will be seeing in practice and in the literature is looking at local strengths. Especially in the global South, I believe that the global South, recently I conducted a study in India on the narratives of autism in India, and I see that there are so many local strengths. I was kind of impressed by people's abilities to think outside the box. I was impressed by the ways in which some families, interpreted their children and thought of their children in complex ways. So there are local strengths there. And I think we are going to see a movement towards capitalizing on those local strengths and working from a space that is based on those local strengths.
Wonderful points that you've shared, Sri. And you know what? A couple of the key words that I picked up were just the consistency, which is lacking, and how no particular one model can really fit everything. I think culture, every country, in fact, city has to literally adapt it to their own requirements. So thank you so much for your very, very valid and interesting points. So Mythili, we love to hear from you. You had such a rich experience in education and having worked in many organizations. How should India really understand education, per se? Would you please throw some light on that?
How should India understand inclusive education? In the sense that what are our contexts? What is the ground reality, and what does it take to implement education policies across such a large population?
See, one thing is, how do you understand now that we have new education policy 2020? That's going to be the guiding principle, because it is being implemented. Simultaneously with the introduction, with the NEP coming into force, opened up for the entire education system when it was released. Simultaneously, the action plans were also, in place for most of the aspects. I think it is called Parak or something. Sarthak or Parak. I don't really remember properly. I think it is Sarthak. See, now with that in place, I think that's the guiding force, and we should apply it in spirit and in letter. See, because as you know that India makes fairly good policies. What is lacking is its implementation on the ground. But in this era, with my experience, what I have seen is that in the last 6-7 years, to reach the scale and the magnitude has been quite vigorous. Of course, it comes with a lot of challenges, which I do not deny at all. When it is about reach, it is about, making schemes and programs and also interventions accessible to everyone. And mostly it is through online mode, because COVID also came very handy at that time. So now I'll divide your question into two parts. How do you understand education system in India, and how do you understand inclusive education? To me, it is not about understanding education system in India, because systems, structures, everything isn't, it's been there for the last 75 years or more, even pre-independence period. So we have a fairly robust system with macro, meso, and micro level, and fairly well laid out, planning at a district level being the unit of planning and implementation. And now, so when I'm coming to how do you understand the inclusive education, it is a regard to, my perspective is that it has to be understood in the larger framework of social justice, where equity is addressed, fairness is, non-negotiable. Then opportunities for access has to be ensured for all kinds of children, be it disabilities, children with disabilities, or be it children coming from diverse socio-economic, religious backgrounds. So you're actually addressing a lot of issues with regard to the background, maybe in terms of religion, caste, or maybe in terms of the familial context, such as children of first generation learners, or children of 2 or 3 generations ahead in terms of learning. Our equity angle is multi-layered, multidimensional, and has the cultural context as the diversity. I'll tell you one example. In a remote village in Karnataka, there is a village, it's called Kavaspura. It's bordering Shikaripur and Haveri Taluk in Karnataka. A big hill separates the two. And then there's the hill is cut to make the way to, go to both the Haveri district and Shikaripur Taluk of Shimoga district. Now here are fishermen community whose main occupation is fishing, and Kavaspura is a dry land. It's an agricultural land, it's hillocks, and fishermen live here, but go to do fishing during rainy monsoon seasons and they go for about 4, 5, 6 months. And all these children from their families are all first generation learners, most of them. Now they also go along with their families, along with their parents to wherever the parents take them. And then they come back after 3, 4, 5 months, and then they rejoin. They start continuing with the school. Now, will you call this as absenteeism or will you call it as dropout? It is not a dropout. Will you call it as access to education? The access is there, but the nature, the context which Rakshita is saying is quite diverse. Are we addressing these children? Yes. Now, in recent years, the government has made one thing very clear. Whichever the child comes to your school, without asking where the child was previously studying or the transfer certificate, you admit the child to the school in that school in another district. Okay, so now such government measures are also being done. There are a lot now. Mobile education, where teachers go in the van, teachers are mobile, hop from one place to another to give. To tell me, when it is about access, there are diverse ways of access. I tell you one more example. In Andhra Pradesh, Godavari district, West and East Godavari, big rivers. Children live in those islands. I mean, small islands that are there. And it's a big river to cross. So the school is on the boats. When it comes to access, these are things that are happening. Now come to northeastern states of India, where it is Himalayan ranges. Terrain is very difficult. So access is a bigger question there, and it comes with a diverse context of severe weather variations, weather conditions, and also geographical challenges. Now, government has, especially, with the state which I know of little more than other states in Northeast is Sikkim. What they have done for teachers and the entire education system in the diverse terrain is to connect every school, every teacher, every school head, every district education officer with internet connectivity. Excellent. The second thing which the state has done is that it has not kept any vacancies vacant. It has recruited almost all school heads. School heads are the main people who are going to really shape the school. And it is almost like 100% filled vacancies, which is very rare in India. See, this is a education systems context, which I'm now coming to. Now, when that happens, the schools run much better with a leader in the school, with a positional leadership being accorded to the school. It is much, much better. So when you see by and large the governance in the Sikkim state, it's much better than many other states across India. So even the connectivity is such for the teacher and the highest commissioner of education and stuff, people like that, is directly through WhatsApp. Can you ever think of that being a small state, it is feasible? But then can you ever think of a secretary answering a teacher? Yes, it happens. So how are you going to address your issues of diversity, issues of context? It can be through technology, can be through innovations like that of boat schools on the waters, in the boats, or can be through the teachers' empathy and compassion, just as in Kavaspur, when the children come back after 4 or 5 months of their parents doing fishing and coming back, the children are accepted and they're brought back. They're brought back literally. I have gone with them. Hey, come. School is starting. Yes, even I have gone with them. into those very narrow lanes. And children suddenly, they drop everything, whatever they're doing. They do like this and come behind the teacher. Sir, sir barta idare, sir barta hai, sir bandru, are बोल के आते हैं, जाते हैं सर के साथ स्कूल के लिए. See, now these are informal, but these are the socio-emotional spaces where teacher makes a large impact so that the child does not drop out from school. Here do you question about how much the teacher is well-versed with the subjects, how much the teacher is so strong in the content and pedagogical knowledge. These are also equally important, but much more important becomes to retain the students in the school. And so the diversity comes from different contexts. I'll tell you one more example of the excellent technology that was used by Rajat Singh, who won global award for technological innovations in Indian schools. He won a global award. What did he do? That was in Maharashtra, in the remote tribal areas of Maharashtra villages. He found that children does not have textbooks. He found that it's very, very tough. He is one who made the maximum use of technology, developing QR codes, making it available on the mobile phones of their parents, children's parents, and it is just there. And what did he say? He said that for 18th century curriculum, 19th century teachers teaching the 20th century pedagogical methods for the children of 21st century. See the gap. This is exactly the equity issues that we need to address across levels and across systems. So whether you can define social justice or whether inclusivity through social justice angle, look at it from diverse perspectives. Look at it from all angles, but contextualize. I vouch for it, contextualize. The Wi-Fi connectivity of Sikkim need not necessarily work in Maharashtra, which is about 50 times bigger than Sikkim. But the terrain in Sikkim is definitely not the terrain of Maharashtra, right? The tribal communities of Sikkim are definitely not the tribal communities of Maharashtra or Karnataka or Andhra Pradesh. The tribes are different. The tribes are diverse. So look at it from this wider perspective. When we engage, there is no one standard answer. There is no one way of, answering how do you understand our education system. There's no one way. You have to have a perspective to begin and contextualize within that larger perspective, and national education policy drives for us. Okay. I stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was so insightful. And this is why I know the question was very vague. How do we understand inclusive education? But in the Indian context, inclusive education has such a diverse meaning, because access is a primary problem for many communities, not just the disabled children. Like you said, the community, the fisherman community that travels for 6 months, or the community that stays on islands, or the community that has to face severe changes in weather patterns. Thank you so much, Mythili, for bringing that perspective, very much required. My next question is to Tanushree. Tanushree, regarding inclusive education in India, have you observed any noticeable trends or patterns?
Thank you for that question. I think my response is going to echo in many ways what Sridevi and Mythili have already said, but I'll try and expand on some of their responses. So I think one of the biggest shifts that has happened in Indian education policy around inclusive education is the association of disability and inclusive education really coming together. So before before the NEP 2020, the Right to Education Act defined inclusive education in a more broad education for all kind of perspective. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, which was drawing on the United Nations Conventions, the Rights of Persons with Disability, was drawing on a very disability-centered definition of inclusive education. And now with the NEP and with a lot of advocacy from disability rights groups, we've seen that inclusive education is now defined primarily in terms of disability. And that was something that people were advocating for a very long time. I think primarily because we want to have sort of be able to hold the state accountable for the implementation of inclusive education for kids with disabilities, and maybe enable sort of better budgetary allocation if that is defined in such a way. But I think at the same time, it also then makes us think about, what does this mean for the broad social justice agenda of inclusive education, right? Dr. Rao spoke about the fact that there are multiple marginalizations or the intersectional aspects of exclusion, right? So if we're going to define inclusive education in these sort of narrow, only disability terms, what does this mean for the place of inclusive education within a broader social justice agenda when we know that say ableism and casteism and patriarchy all operate together in these different kinds of ways? So I think that's something for us, that's a trend that we're noticing, but that's something for us to also be sort of wary about in the future. I think another trend or pattern is the sort of increasing research around identification, assessment, and testing within disability. And this is more broadly as well, outside of disability as well. And I think, this work on assessment and identification is really important because there's a lot of really good research showing how, especially in the context of developmental disabilities, we've been relying on sort of Western standards of assessments, right? Which are just not culturally accurate in so many different kinds of ways. And so we need better ways to identify children with disabilities. If we look at, I've been sort of trying to track the UDICE data on like what percentage of children with disabilities are in school in India. And we can see this decline from like 1.1% back in, a couple of years ago to now 0.9%. But because we don't have reliable data or reliable ways of identification, it's really hard to say why this trend is happening. Is it because we've just gotten very bad at identifying, or is it because exclusion is happening, right? And if we look at countries, again, I don't mean to make countries in the global north the benchmark, but other countries would have, say, 15% of kids who are identified as having a disability, right? And so this problem with identification means that we're not able to allocate budgets appropriately for kids. We're not able to allocate teachers resources appropriately, right? And so this is something that hopefully this focus on assessment and testing will improve. But again, I think it's also important to think about what is this greater identification of disability going to do if there are no support services that buttress this identification process. Does this mean it might lead to more stigmatization and exclusion in schools? If we look at the NEP, we're sort of planning these sort of resource room kinds of models more and more, right? And so what this might mean is that we identify more kids and we send them to different classrooms in the same school. And that's been, I don't know if that's a model of inclusive education that we want to adopt in the Indian context. And again, sort of to my initial point around like social justice, what does this mean for like looking at the relationship between ableism and casteism and other kinds of exclusions that exist in India? A third sort of trend is that a lot of the research in inclusive education in India started off by looking at sort of gaps. What is India not doing? What are teachers not doing? There's a lot of research on sort of teachers in India having poor attitude. They are around inclusive education, but also around like just generally teachers in India are lazy, they're unmotivated, they're absent. There's a lot of deficit-based research around inclusive education and teachers in India. And to some extent, this was really important work when it was happening because it did bring to light the problems that exist in the system. But I think what we're seeing more and more of now, and I hope we continue to see more of, is sort of more participatory work, more critical work that's happening with teachers and children. To what Dr. Rao said, more sort of work on sociocultural understandings of disability and inclusive education. Sort of how do we do inclusive education in the local context of India? I think there's more work that's starting to happen in that. And again, that's been able to happen because people have laid these very strong foundations for us to understand what are the challenges. And now maybe we can work towards thinking about participatory solutions that come to this. I think another space where inclusive education research sort of needs to happen more of, or we need to think more critically about, is the low-cost private school space and the privatization of education space that's happening. And because, the policy that I spoke of sort of applied very differently to these spaces, and in low-cost private school spaces, they don't apply at all. And so thinking about if parents are sending their children to privatized schools, or that states are sort of doing more public-private partnerships, what does that mean for the inclusion of children with disabilities, especially when this sort of no rejection policy that the state has doesn't apply to these spaces, right? So thinking about that. And the last thing that I'll say in terms of sort of trends or patterns is that there's a lot of tremendous research in inclusive education, but I think there's more that we need to do to hear from disabled children and their experiences in school, and how they might want to imagine what schooling looks like for them. And also from the perspective of teachers, not based on sort of what they're not doing, and we have enough of that, but more of what they are doing in classroom spaces. What are they trying to do to make inclusive classrooms happen? What does inclusion really mean to them? I can give an example from my own research. I was working with sort of Muslim women teachers in different cities in India, and for them, inclusive education just couldn't be about disability, or couldn't just be about disability, because it was about the intersection of religion and gender and disability and class all going together. Right. So how do we work with teacher perspectives is something that I think we should be thinking a lot more about, and also thinking about teachers' working conditions. There's enough research that tells us that teachers are working in very, very exploitative circumstances in some cases. And, we're expecting these teachers to then challenge ableism and casteism and the patriarchy in the classroom. So I'll stop here. Yeah.
Shri, it was really interesting that you spoke about strengths that we're finding that we need to work with. Tanushree also mentioned about the majority of research being deficit based on what the gaps are. Mythili spoke about how challenging some of these situations really are, and that sometimes pedagogy can't even be a priority. I mean, pedagogy has to be a priority, but not your number one priority when you're recruiting teachers. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Thank you, Rakshita, and thank you, Tanushree, for bringing up the issue of a historical and traditional deficit-based approach. I think that's been one of the biggest issues with the conception of special education. The conception of disability in the global north has been based on a deficit model. It's been based on a medical model, but it's because of the advocacy of people with disabilities, the advocacy of families of children with disabilities, that we are now shifting away and moving away from that deficit-based model. But special ed, as it was known and as it was understood, the model and the framework has now moved to countries in the global south, because again, we are always emulating what the global north is doing. And there's a problem with that deficit-based approach, right? Because there is the expectation that your role is to look for flaws, and your role is to identify the flaws and correspondingly correct those flaws, right? But what would we learn if we began with with respecting the voices of people who are in those situations, whether it is the families of children with disabilities, or whether it's the fishermen and their children, whether it's communities in the Northeast who are in diverse living conditions. Instead of making a judgment, these families don't care, they don't want to send their children to school, education doesn't matter to them. What if we ask them questions such as, what matters to you? What does education mean to you? What is your dream for your children? What if we began from there? If we began from the assumption that these are communities and families who can tell you what they want, and who can articulate what their challenges are, and what would we learn if we listen to them instead of focusing on strength. So I think across the view, even coming back to what Tanushree said, I think even for teachers, whether it's in India or elsewhere, there is, with inclusive education, the teachers come under the spotlight. If it's not working in a classroom, they are going to be in the spotlight. And so there is a tendency to pass judgment, and in some instances, rightfully so. But in a lot of the instances, teachers are also players in larger structural systems. So if you're teaching a classroom of 45 children, in my recent study, I observed a couple of classrooms with 45 children in that class, right? How are you going to implement inclusive education as, in its authentic form, or universal design of learning with 45 children? Teachers need supports. Teachers need ongoing professional development. Teachers need mentoring. And without those supports, it might be difficult to implement these strategies. So we have to, again, think of ways in which each of these stakeholders, we can think of, we can view them from a strengths-based lens. And I think it's important to pause and find out what their perspectives are, like Tanushree is doing in her study, which is really important.
This was part 1 of our episode with the researchers, where we tried to understand the context in which education is set. In the next part, we will discuss what is required for change to happen. This podcast was designed by Namita and Rakshita, edited by Usaid Sheikh. See you next Friday with part 2 of Daisies, Edelweises and Irises, DEI in Education.